First, let's mark the squares the queen attacks. We'll mark this as black, and we'll note that these are all the squares we cannot go to. Next, we can notice that there are some squares on the board that the knight can only reach to with one single square. I call these squares end squares, as you basically jump into them and you must leave the exact way you came in. We're going to mark these squares in brown, just to take note of them, as they're not really that important to the overall structure, as when you go into them, you immediately leave. Next, we'll designate two loops on the board. These two loops are separate from each other, and it takes a couple moves to get from one loop to the other loop. We will consider these two loops as two different worlds in a way, where depending on what square the knight is going to, you need to enter a specific loop, and then you can head to that square. We can also notice here that all the brown squares are connected to one of the two loops. So we can put little dots in those brown squares to designate as which loop it is a part of. We'll mark the rest of the squares in purple. These squares will be our designated portal squares that will get us from the blue loop over to the red loop and vice versa. First, we'll look at the top right and the bottom left areas, as they are easier to understand than the bottom right. In the top right portal, you can see the entrance is over at F6 and the exit is over at G6 if you want to go from the blue loop to the red loop, and it's the other way around if you want to go from the red loop to the blue loop. So if, for example, you're going somewhere along the path on the blue loop and you need to get to somewhere on the red loop, like, for example, if for some reason at some point we need to get from B4 to A4, which is a part of the puzzle, you could just go up there, go through the portal, and then go along the blue loop. Although in that example, it would be easier to use the bottom left portal, as the entrance from going from blue to red would be at C2, and the exit would be at C3. In the bottom right, we have 4 combinations of portal, although 2 of them are basically redundant, as you can just use one of the first 2 portals plus a move on a loop, and it will be equivalent in moves and be the same entrance and exit. Let's end off with an example. At some point in the puzzle, we'll be landing on the C8 square. The next square we need to go to is the B8 square. The C8 square is a square that's on the red loop, while the B8 square is an end square connected to the blue loop. Thus, we're going to have to make it over from the C8 square to the B8 square. This can be done in 3 steps. First off is traversing to a portal entrance on the red loop. Second, go through the portal. Third, go from the portal exit on the blue loop over to the B8 square. We notice that the closest portal on the red loop is the top right one. But we can also notice that the closest portal exit to the square we're going to, the B8 square, is actually the bottom left one. And it can be shown that both of these directions are equivalent. So we'll start with the top one. From the C8 square, we're going to move over, going to E7, and then going to G6. From G6, that is the portal entrance. The portal is outlined as follows. From G6, we go up to F8. Then we go over to H7, and then we exit to the blue portal loop exit over on F6. Now, the final step, step 3, will be moving over to the final square. From F6, we can go to E8. From E8, we can go over to C7. From C7, we can hit to the corner on A6. And then from A6, we can finally make it to the B8 square. We'll look at the second path. The second path is also the same total amount of squares because, well, its entrance to the portal is 1 farther away, the exit is 1 closer. From the C8 square, we move down to the B6 square, and then down to the A4 square. From the A4 square, we move over to C3, that being our portal entrance. From C3, we jump through the portal, going B1, A3, C2. From C2, we're exiting the portal, we're going up towards B4, then over to A6. And from A6, we finally land on B8, completing our path.